Hello, everyone. It's King's Comments with a further narrative commentary on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the geopolitical perspectives of all parties included. Before I begin with the actual military situation on the ground and sort of what the lay of the land is for all of the parties, I want to make this point known, and that is that to all parties, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And what we're seeing play out here is exactly that narrative. When you go back in history and you look at a similar war that was fought on very similar terrain and ground, World War II in the Eastern Theater of Operations, what we're seeing play out right now in the Russia-Ukraine conflict isn't that much different to the conflict that took place between the Nazi Germans and the Soviet Russians. And I'm going to make this point clear to everyone. The German army of World War II is arguably, or was arguably, the greatest army the world's ever seen. They had able commanders, some of the greatest commanders in World War II, people like Erich von Manstein, capable commanders who led German divisions. You had some of the best tank formations, some of the best tanks in the world, and yet the Germans could never hope to win that war. And the reason why was because they had their opening when they actually created the Operation Barbarossa. They had their opening before 1941. They had their opening to take Moscow in the winter of 1941, and they failed to do so. And thus, because they failed to do so, the war was doomed thereafter. And the reason for that came down to the three M's: men, math, and material. And if you think about what I just said there, men, math, and material, what exactly am I referring to? Well, the Germans could never replace the men that they lost on the front lines in the Eastern European theater of operations during the first part of Operation Barbarossa. They couldn't replace those crack soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Those were people that were battle-hardened, that had been transferred from the Western Front onto the Eastern Front to fight this campaign. And the losses in the early part of 1941 for the German army were horrific. You know, we often hear about the Soviet losses in the first part of the battle for Operation Barbarossa. And while the Russians suffered horrific losses, they could replace the men they lost because they had an unbelievable reserve of units in Siberia, units in the Far East that they could draw upon, and which they did draw upon. The German military was incapable of being able to replace the men they lost. So that's the first problem. The second problem is math as a function of the first problem. The math is that you just can't conscript men to fight a war that they're incapable of fighting unless they're trained. And in the process of training new men for combat, you're going to have a situation where you're creating a problem on the battlefield for existing brigades, existing battalions, because they can't replace the men that they've lost fast enough. And this is essentially what happened to the German military in World War II. They were losing men so quickly on a daily basis that their ability to draw upon their reserves was severely hampered because the Germans in World War II were very big on training. They didn't just conscript people and throw them into battle until the very end, when they were forced into doing it because they had no choice. So the math for the military just wasn't there for the German Wehrmacht. The third thing was materiel. Now let's talk about that for a moment. The German had a decisive advantage in the beginning of the war in armaments production. They had a decisive advantage in military hardware, airplanes. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies for the most part. And they lost that advantage because they could no longer replace the planes that were being shot down or the tanks that were being eliminated. The Russians lost far more tanks than the Germans did, but they could replace them because their armaments industries were churning out tanks at a level that nobody could have foreseen, not even the Germans. So the losses could be replaced easily on the battlefield, and the Germans could not adequately, despite Albert Speer's ownership of the armaments industry, they could not replace those losses as quickly and as efficiently as the Russian army was able to replace its. So the war was lost in 1941. What ended up happening between 1941 and 1945 were battles of attrition. And the last major offensive that the Germans were able to mount was at the Battle at Kursk, which is the largest tank battle even today ever fought. And while the Germans were able to actually win that battle from a tanker perspective in terms of losses, they actually lost the conflict because they were never able to mount any counteroffensive in the future because they didn't have the armaments, they didn't have the air power by that point, and they didn't have the appropriate men to be able to deal a significant blow to the Russian attrition offensive that took place from 1941 through to 1945. So during that 4-year or 3.5-year period, the Russians basically decimated the German army in the east. And they did it incrementally, and it became more incrementally as time went on, because the Germans were never able to mount an effective counterattack to slow down the Russian horde. Now, why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant because the same situation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is playing out. And what we're seeing here is we're seeing a situation where the Ukrainian military in general doesn't have the men, doesn't have the math, and doesn't have the material. Now, I want to make this point perfectly clear. The billions of dollars that have been sent to Ukraine for armaments, for heavy arms, for HIMARS, for Patriot systems, all of that's been destroyed because they simply don't have air power, and they're easy to spot. And for whatever reason, American and Western capitals completely didn't think that the Russians were capable of destroying these things en masse, or perhaps underestimated the ability of the Russian military to pinpoint, destroy these kinds of systems. If you take a look at what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, what's really happening is the Ukrainian soldier, the infantryman, is being let down by the fact that they don't have adequate artillery, they don't have adequate air defense, they don't have anything to support the infantry on the ground. The one constant for the Ukrainian army has been their FPV drone capabilities, but the problem there is that they don't have the math. And the math is that the Russians have mass-produced these drones, and you're seeing these drones flying everywhere on the point of contact, the combat point of contact. And they're eliminating heavy armor. They're eliminating fighting vehicles at a rate that's absolutely astonishing. When you consider all that money that the United States sent in the aid package, and a lot of the Bradley fighting vehicles, the M1 Abrams tanks, a lot of these things have been pushed to the rear now because they're no longer useful on the battlefield, because the Abrams is easy prey for Russian FPV drone operators and artillerymen. And I think this is a major, major situation. I mean, I'm not even going to talk about the Russian air power with the FABs that are being used to devastating effect. But this contributes to what I said earlier, which is a lack of men, meaning that there's not enough quality soldiers left to fight. The math isn't there because you can't replace those people with conscripts who don't want to fight. The idea or notion that you can replace battle-hardened nationalists with conscripts who are trying to avoid military service, the idea that those people are going to be somehow motivated to fight the Russian army, a professional army at that, is completely ludicrous. So this is, as I said in an earlier audio message, this is pretty much military suicide on the part of the Ukrainian military. There's absolutely no hope, no chance of winning a war this way. And it's just not possible. And you can see this being played out in the way things are starting to take place in the Ukrainian general staff, where either Zelensky is either shouting at his generals or he believes his generals aren't telling him everything. I mean, I don't know why anyone would be shouting at his generals or why he would be shouting at his generals, or he doesn't believe he's being told everything. I mean, this war is being fought where everyone can see it on the Telegram channels. And if you really want an up-to-date, unbiased opinion of where the war is going and how it's going, then all you have to do is look at Dima's commentary on the Military Summary channel, and you'll be able to see where how the war is going on all the front lines. So if he really doesn't know or doesn't understand what's happening, and he's blaming his generals for not telling him, I suppose he should be looking on YouTube and watching Dima's channel at Military Summer channel to get that information, or perhaps his generals should be looking at that, because he's actually giving the Ukrainians and the Russians, to some extent, possibilities of where they're likely to be next in a lot of cases. But this is a complete debacle. And as I said earlier, with the World War II analogy, I said that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And when we look at the issue of Russian military doctrine, the Russian military, their doctrine was always and has always been the same. It's never deviated, which is they want to completely destroy Ukraine's capacity to be able to wage war against any of the territories. So how do you destroy that capacity? Is you eliminate a generation of Ukrainian soldiers. And what they've effectively done is they've started to eliminate soldiers en masse. And as I said in a previous commentary, the Ukrainian army cannot resurrect 600,000 men that they've lost in this conflict. They can't resurrect them. And I find it preposterous that the Ukrainian government is still holding firm to these ridiculous numbers of casualties that they've put out on their own side, suggesting that everything is okay when they have to pass these draconian laws, which is the reality of the situation, which means it's not okay. And this reminds me of Nazi Germany in its deathbed or death throes in World War II. Hitler fought with his generals. There was a certain level of detached reality, detachment from reality. And what we're seeing with Zelensky and his generals is a detachment from reality on the ground. The Russians have the men, the math, and the material. And I would also add that they have something that you can't even quantify. And that is the ability to outproduce all of the West put together. And that's a significant situation. And you could see that on full display when it comes to shells or bullets, particularly shells. The Russian military doctrine, while air support is extremely important, has always been heavy on artillery. And you could see that being played out as they destroy Ukrainian artillery, Ukrainian defense systems. You could see that being played out. And right now, what you're looking at is a combat situation where Ukrainian troops on the ground are basically, their armor are their bodies. And they fought valiantly, and one could make the argument that they probably were the best military outside of the Russians in Europe in general. But now they're completely decimated, and this draconian law that they're going to pass where they expect to raise an army of 100,000 men, if they're lucky to do that, will be men that I like to call ghosts. These are people that have no interest in fighting. Otherwise, they would have joined up at the very start, and they're likely to be either cannon fodder or surrender material as we move on to the next phase of this conflict. So from the perspective of what we're seeing on the ground, what we're seeing on the ground is, for lack of a better word, completely embarrassing for the Ukrainian military, to the extent that they can no longer defend areas along the front. So from the Kharkiv region down to the Zaporozhye region, close to the Kherson area, we are seeing Russian advances incrementally, if you want to call it incremental advances. And I think it's very significant that we use that word incremental in a negative way. It's not negative. And the reason why is because the Russian supply lines are significantly shorter. They have access to whatever they need and can draw upon fresh reserves at any point that they need it. And they can actually pause the conflict at their own convenience and then bring in new men to replace the ones they've lost. And while all that's happening, the Ukrainians are incapable of launching counteroffenses. And even when they do, they're repelled because they simply don't have the staying power, the air power, or the artillery to keep it going. And again, I don't know what Western capitals or Western military leaders are thinking, but if you don't understand military history to the extent that you should, and I've got to question whether the people that are 3, 4, or 2-star generals in the military in the Western capitals understand this anymore. I have to assume that they don't, because if anyone hopes or thinks that Ukraine has a hope in hell of actually mounting a counteroffensive in 2025 with the recruits that they're actually looking to conscript, then what the Western capitals are doing is certifying a generation of Ukrainians to their deathbeds. This is absolutely horrific on a level that I can't even begin to say. And For what? For nothing. I mean, the Ukrainians went on this counteroffensive in 2023, which was their best hope, and it failed miserably at the expense of gaining ground that they now have lost and then some. So what has this all been for? I mean, let's be realistic here. What has all this been for? And any hope of a counterinsurgency in the East is completely without merit. It will never happen. And the reason why is because the majority of the people in the East were always Russian-speaking and supported the Russian military in its ground campaign as it entered the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye regions to liberate them. And I use that word liberate, and I don't use that word liberate lightly. I don't believe in taking sides per se, but what I am suggesting here is that what I've seen is a willingness on the Russian side to talk and negotiate, but not to negotiate from a position of weakness. And what I've seen from the Ukrainian side is absolute delusional thinking. This notion that Russia should leave all of the lands and Crimea is absolutely delusional. And this is why the peace conference in Switzerland is a complete farce. I mean, I have to wonder about the credibility of Switzerland now as a neutral partner, because the Swiss are a party to what amounts to a farce. Whatever communique that comes out of this so-called peace conference is completely hollow. It means nothing without one of the parties there. You know, it's kind of funny because during the Vietnam War, Kissinger met with his counterparts quite frequently as Americans were bombing North Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese never wavered in their contempt for Kissinger and the United States, but they still negotiated with Kissinger, and Kissinger still negotiated with them. And what we're seeing right now is we're seeing a world where you have people that are taking these stances that are completely not in line with reality. And they're making the same mistakes that happened in World War II with the German General Staff and Adolf Hitler himself. So I do want to make this comment to people that are looking for a solution to this. I believe that at some point the Ukrainian people will rise up. I also believe that there will be a situation where Zelensky is no longer the leader of the country. That situation may come sooner than later, because if he angers his generals, at some point somebody's going to take it out on him. And I don't think that anyone in the Ukrainian military general staff actually believes now that they can win. I mean, even Budanov, who was one of the hawk Banderas when the war started and felt that the Ukrainians could win, is not singing that tune anymore. Syrskyi definitely isn't. No one's heard from Zaluzhny, and the Ukrainian officer corps is completely decimated. The other thing that I've noticed is that the International Foreign Legion, which was once a big thing in 2022, is no longer a big thing. And the reason why is because the losses from individuals that have gone over to fight as mercenaries have been absolutely horrific on the Legion. So those people are not coming back anymore. This is a war or conflict, I should say, that should never have been fought. Now that we're here, in the second year of war or third year of war, I think, we're in a situation where the Russians are quite comfortable carrying this war for another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And I think that people don't understand that at all. I just don't think people understand that the Russian economy is benefiting from this conflict. What was once thought as an opportunity to destroy Russia, incapacitate Putin, and incapacitate the Russian economy through sanctions, has turned out to be a colossal failure. Russian economic growth is shooting through the roof. The Russian military-industrial complex is growing at an alarming rate. And the Russian army, at the end of the day, once this is all said and done, is going to be a behemoth that will never shrink back again. And I think this should never be lost on Western capitals. Additionally, the Russian nuclear threat is only going to become more demonstrable. So this whole exercise in futility from the West perspective is completely delusional. Now, from a military perspective, getting back to what I said earlier about men, math, and material, all along the front, what you're seeing is a remarkable plan on the part of the Russian military to stretch the already thinned Ukrainian army even thinner. And so just recently we heard about the Kharkiv offensive, which took place on May the 10th, moving more east, stretching the Ukrainian military even farther, which means that they can be outflanked on other areas of the front as the Russians use natural obstacles like the river as an opportunity for crossings to outflank and encircle large formations of Ukrainian troops. And this is like, again, as I've said before, the Ukrainian soldier is every bit as good as the Russian soldier and is every bit as good as any NATO soldier, if not better. But they've been betrayed by their officer corps. They've been betrayed by their commanders. They've been betrayed by their leadership. And they've been betrayed by the West, because the idea or notion that any military, infantry, ground capacity could win on its own without air power, without the ability to launch artillery attacks in mass, is absolutely not plausible. It just can't work. And what the Russians have done is they've suckered the Ukrainians in at every moment into moving large formations of troops into areas for the purposes of encircling them, decimating them, and destroying them. And it's like the commanders, Ukrainian commanders, don't seem to learn any lessons from World War II, or don't seem to learn any lessons about what they should and shouldn't do. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The Russian military, as it stands today, isn't the Russian military that went in 2022. This is a military that is completely on the same page. And what we're seeing with this Russian military is a monster. And every day they're getting stronger and stronger and stronger. Now, the Ukrainian soldier is an exceptional force of strength on its own. But it doesn't have armor. It doesn't have air support. It doesn't have artillery. It doesn't have the things that it needs. And I'm not going to blame that on the West. Excuse me, I'm not blaming that on the West. I believe the West has sent adequate munitions. What I do believe is that their generals and their officer corps are lacking. And they're lacking because they haven't used the ground to their advantage the way that a military devoid of air power should. And what I'm saying by that is that from a military perspective, and I'm just going back in history, I said this in an earlier commentary, from a military perspective, the only way that a conventional military force with air power has been defeated is through what I like to call rearguard actions or insurgencies. And the problem with the Ukrainian military is that I don't believe this rearguard capability or rearguard insurgency has been explored properly enough. They would have lost a lot more ground, but they would have cost the Russians a lot of men, material, and math to take that ground, to the extent that they've done so far. The Russians don't want to be in Ukraine for any length of time other than to destroy and decimate the Ukrainian army. They have no plans, per se, on taking over Kiev. That was never their plan. They wanted to liberate their provinces. They want to create a buffer zone so that their cities don't get targeted. But they have no real designs on Western Ukraine because they're not Russian-speaking, per se. They're not pro-Russian. And that's just asking for a rearguard insurgency kind of action. But if the Russians are forced into doing it in order to protect their cities, they will. And I'm beginning to see the makings of that as a rump Ukrainian state may be the only thing that's left when it's said and done. When you start looking at these buffer zones may go, deep into the central part of Ukraine to ensure that the Ukrainian army never rises again. And I believe the Russian military is quite comfortable fighting this kind of combat for another 3, 4, 5 years to eliminate everyone. The Ukrainians cannot afford for that to happen. And in the meantime, I do believe that there will be some negotiated settlement which allows the West to claim that at least some part of Ukraine didn't fall to the Russians, when we all know that the Russians never wanted all of Ukraine. So the West has lost this war. They've already lost it, and they've lost it because of the fact that when people see men being taken off the streets against their will to fight in a war that they never really wanted to fight, then you know you've lost. That's just the way it is. Professional armies win wars. And what the Russians have is a professional army. And they also have the ability to add more professionals every day because they bring the training that comes with it. So the thing that I want to make sure people understand is that you just can't put bodies on the battlefield and think you're going to win. That's not how wars are fought. You can't do that. You just can't put a fresh body on the battlefield and think you're going to win. And you have to train that person. That person has to become a professional. They have to be able to handle the everyday disciplines that are needed to fight combat. And this is not for the faint of heart. So the notion that you could just put a body and that body will plug a hole, in a lot of cases, these new recruits are going to create a new problem for the Ukrainian military, because it'll put their entire defense lines more at risk than not having them. Because I I expect to see mass surrenderings on a level that we haven't seen so far. So on the ground, this is a situation on all fronts that's looking horrific for the Ukrainians. There isn't one area of the front where anyone can say that the Ukrainians have got a strategic victory or have had a strategic opportunity to hurt the Russians. There isn't one place on the battlefield that exists today where that opportunity exists. And you're starting to see it in the Western media because they don't even want to talk about it now, because it's getting to the point where the only thing they talk about it is the valiant defense the Ukrainian soldiers putting up. And while that is true, it comes at a horrific loss, and there's absolutely no winning that war for Ukraine, whether it's in Chasiv Yar, whether it's in any location. And I said this earlier when I said that the opportunity for negotiation on the part of Ukraine should have come in 2022 when they made those gains. They should have negotiated a settlement at that point. And with the fact that they didn't, and feeling their bones, so to speak, they were handed horrific losses, and they've never and will never be able to counterattack in any measure ever again. This game is over. And I think for people that are watching other YouTube channels, specifically channels such as the Duran or Alexander Mercouris, or if you're watching the Dima Summary channel, and I know a lot of people may find these channels a little bit, big on details, a little boring for some people to follow. But the general theme of all of these channels is the theme of reality. And the reality is that there's absolutely no hope of winning. And when I talk about the geopolitical situation, I'm talking about it in the context that this war was fought from the West perspective. I think from the United States perspective, this war was fought differently from the European perspective. In the U.S., in the U.S. military and political establishment, I believe that they felt that this war was necessary in order to topple Putin, to destroy the Russian military-industrial complex, to hobble Russia permanently. And what they found is that Russia has only gotten stronger and is a dominant force to be reckoned with. And a nuclear-powered 5,600 nuclear warheads, that will use it if provoked. And what's happened is that now the West is beginning to see this retreat from the United States. And when you start to have to resort to strategic ambiguity, it's a pretty good sign that you're pretty much dead. You know, the French, the Europeans, the NATO countries, they could pour in 20,000, 30,000 men. They will all get slaughtered. And the reason why they'll get slaughtered, and this is without Russia deploying a tactical nuclear weapon, is because there's no air power. If you think that NATO soldiers are better than Ukrainian soldiers, I got news for you. They're not. Ukrainian soldiers are better than NATO soldiers for this kind of battlefield. And NATO soldiers will more than likely run at the first sign of combat at the point of contact if they see Russian assault stormtroopers. This is a war at the end of the day where men, math, and material have already dictated the outcome. And unless you know about war, and I believe that the majority of people in the Western capitals do not know about war. And if they do, this war was simply an opportunity to use Ukraine's men as cannon fodder to bring down regime change, or to bring regime change to Russia, similar to what happened with Gorbachev and Yeltsin. That's simply not going to happen, and it hasn't happened. It's actually made Russia a power beyond what it was before this war started. So, having said that, my next commentary, I think, is going to be more about the United States and China, because I believe that the next flare, or the next situation, or the next risk is this impending conflict with China, because the United States knows that any conflict with Russia will lead to their demise, or mutual assured destruction. The Russians have enormous capabilities, as we've been able to see with their Kinshal weapons, their hypersonic weapons. They have enormous capabilities that the United States, from a technical point of view, doesn't have. Technological point of view, doesn't have at present. Not that they won't have, but they don't have it now. And the advantages with respect to what Russia has is significant enough where that deterrent will deter further escalation, in my opinion, because the West are big talkers, big bluffers, but in the final analysis, they are hot air, and Vladimir Putin isn't. So, no matter how big Macron talks, or any of the Western leaders talk, they will never put their soldiers in Ukraine en masse, because they fear getting decimated, destroyed, and they also fear collapse of their own economies, collapse of their civilization. So none of us should pay any attention to those words, because they're straight up bluffing. The Russians aren't bluffers. They've told NATO that Ukraine will not be a part of NATO, and Ukraine will not be a place where Americans put strategic nuclear weapons on their soil. And that's simply the case. It's not going to happen. And if anyone thinks that it will, they obviously don't understand Russia too well, and they don't see the balance of power in Europe, and they don't understand that this is an existential threat to the Russian state. And I think Russian doctrine is a little bit different from American doctrine. Russian doctrine is that anything that is an inherent threat to the state is a situation where a tactical nuclear strike is warranted. And the Russians will do it. And if the West wants to ratchet that up, and I know they don't, then their capitals may cease to exist, or at the very least their military command centers may cease to exist. So this isn't a game that anyone wants to play with Russia, but I certainly see an opportunity on the West part to play a similar game with China. And I believe the rapprochement with China and Russia isn't only by design. And I'll get into that further in my next commentary. Thanks very much.